Anna,
Yep.
very good to have you here.
Thank you.
I was concerned if you were going to make in time because of the commute.
That's funny. Yeah, from my room to my living room was not a long
Oh, you,
commute.
you, you were working from home?
Yep.
That's good. So you are a psychologist PhD, and you are a consultant for the Lancet Psychiatry as well, right?
Yeah, I'm actually on the advisory. Um, I don't even know what it's called. An advisory board for one of their many, many commissions. As you know, um, a commission is essentially a set of experts who work together around an important issue. And so Lancet Psychiatry recently launched a commission on psychoses in a global context. And I am part of that advisory group. And we also did some work around this issue that's being published soon in Global Mental Health. So, yeah.
That's neat. And do you see any trends within that commission regarding the treatment of psychosis that would what's my question, that would kind of counteract the usual positions of APA of give meds and push for them ad ad nauseum, or no, they're
Yeah.
more sort of a status quo.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's always, in a place like the Lancet, there's a lot of mainstream ideas circulating, obviously, but there are some interesting features of this commission in particular. Work Package 5 is actually called the Lived Experience Work Group. And that really is connecting people who identify as having had a psychiatric diagnosis or having received services for a psychiatric problem in the past. And so it's bringing people from around the globe together to include and center more the perspectives of people who feel like they've been harmed by psychiatry or people who have something to say from a place of firsthand or lived experience. So that is one cool thing that's happening there. And the other piece that I would note is that there is, I think, a work package that's working on human rights, and that rights based framework for thinking about mental health problems, I think, is very powerful and tends to challenge the status quo. I think one key person in that arena is the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, Dr. Danius Puras. His reports were really crucial to move things towards a rights-based framework. And I think the fact that that work package exists in this particular commission is really interesting.
It's already big. And
Yeah.
speaking of names, we had Sandy Steingard here. You introduced her to me, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
Right. And we got to talk about the perspective of a psychiatrist on the Open Dialogue and her experience in Vermont. And we spoke about the frustration and the efforts and the success. So would you tell us, how did you get yourself into the Open Dialogue? Or maybe we should start. Yeah, let's start with that. How did you get yourself into this project in Vermont, and was it called, and what was it like?
So my interest in first episode psychosis started when I was working at a community-based mental health center in Brazil, and just as a clinical psychologist. And what I noticed is, well, these centers are were developed to help people who had long-term hospitalizations. We were also starting to see young people who were having their first break. And it seemed really difficult to have those two populations in the same space. And youth felt really hopeless about, their prospects in life when they saw, their colleagues who were kind of far ahead, in their treatment um, trajectory, just, doing very poorly. And I also felt like we didn't have a lot of resources to offer to youth, more specifically. And so I was really interested in figuring out whether, are there approaches out there that avoid a lot of the pitfalls that cause you know, bad outcomes in mental health treatment. And at that point, I was becoming very skeptical with psychiatry and with especially with medications. Um, I came with the medications. I came from a place of lived experience myself, as I had been diagnosed with a serious mental illness as a child and heavily medicated for a number of years. A lot of it against my will, and then was kind of able to get out of it. And that's what brought me to the field as a whole. And so I was very critical of kind of coercive measures in psychiatry. And I saw a lot of that in my day to day work, and also in over medicating youth, but also in general, like as a practice in psychiatry. And so I was really interested in criticizing that, but also proposing something different. And then, you know, Robert Whitaker came to Brazil once and gave a talk that changed my life. And I read his book and became friends with Bob. And he introduced me to a lot of people who were working with Open Dialog. And the most interesting feature for me there was avoiding neuroleptic medications at the beginning of treatment and consistently not using these drugs to handle, you know, a first episode and getting incredible recovery rates. So I thought to myself, you know, I might as well check this out. And there was nothing written in Portuguese or anyone in Brazil talking about it at the time. And I thought, well, since I'm getting my PhD in first episode, maybe I'll go, you know, to Vermont. And at the time, there was a program in New York as well, and another one in Atlanta. So I thought, you know, maybe I'll go to the US and see how they're doing it. And maybe we can learn something um, about this modality of treatment for youth that we can, you know, perhaps incorporate in our public healthcare system in Brazil. And that's kind of the short story
That's
of how
how
I got involved.
you end up in. Okay, in so then there was this. What's the program running when you got to Vermont?
Yeah, so that's so the program in Vermont has been, and Sandy like spearheaded this in a major way. She, as a psychiatrist and as a person who people respect a lot in Vermont and frankly internationally as well, she's very highly regarded and an incredible clinician as well as a great person, as you know because you interviewed her. Um, she was really instrumental in bringing some of these things to Vermont, but there was also like an impressive kind of grassroots effort where you know a few clinicians and um, some people who were service users in the state um, slowly started getting trained and getting more and more interested in practicing. There was fertile ground, I think, in Vermont because there was a group that was very interested in family therapy for a long time. And then one of the Norwegian people who are you know crucial to kind of coming up with this open dialogue approach used to go to Vermont a lot. He was an outdoors man who liked hiking, and so those kind of personal relationships developed and grew, and then people started training more and more, and then the network of people who actually knew something about open dialogue grew. And then you know the more um, concrete, say, structures in the state started to become interested in implementing this. And so that's kind of how it grew. And then something, you know, an accident happened where the hospital, like the state hospital, flooded. I don't know if Sandy mentioned that, but they needed to come up with some innovative approaches to deal with the fact that their hospital beds were no longer available. And that was a great kind of opportunity that they took to expand services offered in that perspective. And then New York and Atlanta are totally different cases. I don't know how interested you are in getting into that, but they're quite different.
We're learning, so please.
Yeah. So New York City's parachute program was inspired by other programs around the world. But the one novelty there is that there were open dialogue features to it, and there was also peer support that was built into their program. So it was kind of the first time that those two things met, like peer support and open dialogue. And they were actually a federal grant, a very big grant, I think a $16 million grant to pilot and implement mobile crisis teams that would go to people who are, having problems or having, mental health crisis, and then see them in their home and do network meetings with them. And then they also had a respite space, which, was a space that people could go to if they couldn't really stay at home with whatever was happening. And they had several different teams, and I think one or two pure respites. I can't really remember right now the exact number. And it was kind of unfortunate because the program really ended when the grant ended. They couldn't really figure out how to keep it sustainable. And that has a lot to do with billing structures and Medicaid in the United States. It just really doesn't lend itself to how open dialogue needs to be organized. And so there are a lot of like barriers related to that, to funding, billing, and all of this. And also just the way the American healthcare system is organized is just so horrendous that it's hard to implement something like
I
that.
wanted to ask about specifically about the effort of adaptation, and maybe I should use the word fidelity for the sake of how much of the open dialogue is preserved here, and because we have the assertive community treatment teams, but so let's go there. So what is it like? Because at some point I'm going to ask you to just give a definition of open dialogue, because with everything that is happening in the field, it may come to you as a surprise, or maybe not, that when I bring these things up, folks look at me like, "What are you talking about?" Right? For some reason, and I mean, we know the reason. The reason is that we consume predominantly in this field the publications that are sponsored by pharma, because they do make the news, they do make the open articles, open access on PubMed. They and we unfortunately are becoming an abstract reading profession. So I need to hear all those things. I need to hear what the open dialogue is, if you can explain, and what is like the effort to adapt to the American context.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good place to start. So, Open Dialogue developed originally in Finland, and it came out of what is called need adapted treatment model. Um, and in the 80s, there was a federal mandate, as there was in many other countries in the world, to deinstitutionalize long term patients living in psychiatric hospitals and provide community based care, right? That happened in the United States, in Brazil, in France, and pretty much all of the developed world. Um, the way the Finns did it, though, was interesting. In an area of Finland called Western Lapland, they organized this system of care that essentially revolves around um, open dialogue. And what that is both a way to organize a mental health system and a type of psychotherapy. It's a type of family therapy, in fact. There are a lot of different inspirations, theoretical inspirations for open dialogue, including the work of Vygotsky, who's a Russian um, psychologist, I think, or a Russian author, and other philosophical constructivist authors as well. And also, the Milan School of Family Therapy is one big kind of source of inspiration. And essentially, the entire treatment revolves around what they call the social network meetings. And those network meetings bring in the natural supports of the person at the center of concern. So, whoever is in crisis chooses who they want to be sort of their supports during that crisis. A team of at least two therapists convene a meeting, preferably in the person's home, and where they're most comfortable. It can be in the home, it can be at a cafe. They were very flexible about that. And then they have a meeting to discuss the problem. And so there are a few principles of how they do that. It's kind of a different conversation than your regular therapeutic conversation. Um, so some of the important features of open dialogue are to respond immediately. So, within 24 hours, you probably want to schedule a network meeting with your person in crisis and their natural supports. It's important to be flexible, both like in where you meet, but also in how often you meet and how long the meetings take and how many meetings you need and the length of treatment. If you're going to meet for a month, for a year, for 3 years. So all of those elements of flexibility are really important. Um, and then they use a technique called reflection, which essentially is talking where it's a technique where the two therapists talk to each other in front of the network, and they kind of talk to each other. They turn to each other, like their bodies turn, and it's a weird thing at first, but it's very powerful. And they sort of repeat what they heard, and they offer the opportunity for people to weigh in and correct, and and they also share sort of their impressions and how they feel about what they heard, and that has like a really interesting effect, where people hear what others hear from what they said and then give it back to them to weigh in on that, and that whole process is kind of the entire thing. And then nothing is discussed about the person without the person being present. And so all decisions are made. So there are no like team meetings where you talk about a patient, quote unquote, and then make decisions about their treatment without them being there. So that's another very important thing. And it's also non-competing modality. So like decisions about treatment and the plan is those things happen in this meeting, but you can also get individual psychotherapy or medication management or whatever else, art therapy, whatever other modalities you want to get, you can. But sort of the network meeting is the place where you decide everything and where you check in about your treatment. They also avoid the use of neuroleptic medications, as I mentioned, as a first line of treatment because they feel like that really makes it difficult for people to mobilize their internal kind of resources to go through a crisis because they're very strong medications and they sedate people pretty heavily, and you really need to be present and sort of there to mobilize your resources to go through a crisis. And then there's this kind of rule that you should, as therapists, speak less than the family and give more space for the family to talk, and that you foster a type of dialogue where you create language to talk about things that seem impossible to talk about, and especially things related to the crisis itself.
This is one thing that when I'm trying to explain this thing to my colleagues, I'm going to have Nick Putman uh, show up, and we have been exchanging some emails. Um, and one of the things that I struggle and I'm trying to tell my colleagues is, according to their reported data, because of course we cannot make a freaking randomized control trial of that stuff, is another nature of event and requires another nature of data collection. But the claim they have is that they managed to avoid at least chronic use of antipsychotic in something between 20 and 30%, no, 80%, 70 to 80% of the patients. And about, they find the chronic use of antipsychotics or neuroleptics to be unavoidable in something between 20 and 30%. And in contrasting with APA recommendations, and you can, if you go to the website, it's going to say, whatever works to bring this person. And of course, they don't use that wording, but we know what most of the randomized control trials for neuroleptics look for is a subdued patient that doesn't have more admissions. When I try to sell that, it's a very challenging experience, and may have costed me some friendships. But I haven't seen myself. I have for the past maybe year and a half since I started this journey with my mentoring institute and with the podcast. I've been changing drastically the way I work and learning about antipsychotic tapers, and has been quite a journey and is doable. And but a first episode psychosis is a different experience, because once you have been exposed to medications for so long, now we have a whole adaptation of your brain to that drug, and the taper becomes a much more delicate experience. But now, considering their claim, can you tell us what overall you saw in your experience with this adaptation of the open dialogue to United States, in terms of results, in terms of success, in terms of meaning? My perspective is this: if of 100 patients on antipsychotics, if 10 of them could be living life without it, and we know the numbers are much higher, even with careless practice like we have here, careless in that regard, to say the least. Um, if 1 out of 10 people don't need to be exposed to those medications and could make without it, it sounds to me that we're doing a lot of damage. So even if we don't see with an adaptation, if we don't see the response rate that they claim in Finland, um, you know, I think it's still a valid thing, even though in this context. So, can you tell us about that, your perception of the response and the success rate of this strategy here in the United States?
Sure. I think one caveat to that is what you were mentioning before in terms of how this approach was adapted here. I think the clinical part in some places is pretty close to what they probably do in Finland, but the system part is absent. And that's really important. One of the findings for the parachute program in New York City was that they were dealing with issues that simply don't exist in Finland, like precarious livelihoods and lack of access to food, to basic resources, and a lot of like challenging urban problems like homelessness um, and substance use, which is definitely different from what they encounter in Finland. So the population is different, but more importantly, the system here, the system is just not there here in the United States. And so this kind of universal healthcare system, free at the point of care, single payer, completely, your point of entry to the system is the same for everyone, really well structured. Does not exist in the United States. And so the system piece, which I think is really important for open dialogue to be open dialogue, is totally absent from the experiences here. With that being said, the clinical part, when it is implemented, I feel like there's a lot of pushback with the medication piece. There's fear of liability in this country like I've never seen in my life. And there were situations in the process of implementing open dialogue in this country where these liability issues came to the center. And and I think there's a lot of hesitancy to bring that issue to reduce medication use, or taper medication use, or not use it at all. That is a taboo in this country. And this is related a lot to what they call it here, evidence-based practices. The science of these evidence-based practices in psychiatry is so bad, it's really difficult to me to understand how they can be taken seriously, and that may be a conversation for a different time. But this is how insurance pays for care, and that's how services are expected to organize the care that they offer, is to provide these evidence-based, and I'm doing air quotes here, I know people can't see me, but these quote unquote evidence-based practices. So That being said, my research in Vermont, I didn't really look at outcomes in a quantitative way. So I didn't design a study that, an experimental study that looked at outcomes over time at all. I was interested in people's experiences with this. And so I did a number of qualitative interviews with people who received open dialogue, or what they call collaborative network approach, in Vermont. And I learned that, the people that I talked to really had incredible experiences with this approach, and um, their outcomes, if you can call it that, to me were quite impressive, including people, young people who were never medicated and were getting care with open dialogue for first episode psychosis, up until people who had been in the system for, decades, and were in and out of hospital and jail and homelessness and all of that. And then, after they started getting open dialogue, they suddenly never got hospitalized ever again. They, tapered their medication to a level that they were comfortable with. And it's just this thing of being heard that seemed to be really therapeutic.
So that would be a question I'll have for you, and I think we don't have an answer, I believe, but your opinion would matter a lot. Um, so I just spoke to Stephen Hayes from the Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, and he just did this major um, sort of a review of the literature where he found some processes that account for change in psychotherapy, more traditional forms of psychotherapy. And so, what do you think is happening? What do you think is happening when you have this discussion and the family and the patient and these two, uh, let's call them therapists for now, and they look to each other and they say, "Well, this is what I see is happening. And what do you guys see?" And then, what do you think? What is the process behind it? What do you think is happening that allows someone who's going through the overwhelming anxiety of having psychotic symptoms and what is the giving meaning? What is it that what is your take on this thing?
Yeah. So I hate to be simplistic, because I think psychiatry is going for more and more complicated, explanations for these things, and ever more complicated diagnoses and all that. But I think it boils down to two things. One is meaning making, and the other is relationships. And I don't think there's much beyond that. And I'm sorry if I'm disappointing with this answer,
Not at
but
all. Not that was my guess. I was guessing. I was really
yeah.
guessing that that meaning, because I was talking about that today with a psych NP that came to knock at the door over a case of a patient who was diagnosed with bipolar over some agitation and God knows what else. And I said, well, I told her, try to figure what happened. First, because the diagnosis of bipolar became a joke, right? We have this author, I think in Switzerland or Sweden, I don't remember, and she keeps publishing these efforts to expand the diagnosis successfully because we jumped from 2% prevalence to 70 in the United States. But basically, I said, look for see if she can give you meaning on what she was going through. Um, and I usually do that because I had training as a psychologist, and that was what I was guessing you're going to say. To be honest with you, and I'll tell you, giving meaning to things is we do that all the time. If you as much as you collide your car, you have a fender bender going home on a Friday night, you have to look at that situation and say something to yourself to make a sense of things. And that kind of seems to give us a sense of, oh, no, all right, I can live with it. And it happened because of this, or, and whatever meaning we find for it, because and that brings some sort of sense of control or sense of being able to manage things, because we do that all the time. And in fact, when patients present with psychosis, first of all, coming up with a meaning to psychosis by yourself must be quite a challenge. And second is everybody involved in your life will just say that you're nuts. So that actually it didn't disappoint at all. It was actually
Good.
very very gratifying.
I'm glad. And I mean, the other interesting piece, I think that they also kind of flip diagnosis on its head a little bit, is that this is an approach that doesn't really understand these problems as happening to individuals or with individuals, but between people. And that is, I think that's also a very smart thing. Instead of focusing on, eliminating symptoms and dealing with the person individually, when you put them in their context, which is, their natural supports, their family, things take on a completely different meaning, and everyone is part of that experience. It may be that one person is experiencing things very acutely, because they might be hearing voices or feeling very scared or feeling that there are people, out to get them. Um, and just very frightened, unable to sleep, and a lot of the things that happen when someone becomes quote unquote psychotic. But um, once you make that a problem of everyone who's around the person and something that's happening between people and within relationships, then kind of the answer also lies there more so than on the person alone. And that, I think, is a very, very good move to begin to find a better way to move through a very radical experience like psychosis.
And I think now you're mentioning, I would expect um, Finland to also have broken families or orphans, or some version of the CYF or whatever other thing they have there. Um, but I can see what you mean about struggling to adapt the program here or the model, because the societal structure is very different. And what other things stay in the way? I mean, you mentioned also the billing, which surprised me. I thought we have figured something about that. I thought, because insurance. I thought, um, especially after happening in Vermont and such. Um, Even keeping in mind the limitations of what is called standard of care in the United States, which is a complete fallacy, and we can go back to that. And I would like your opinion on this thing. But what other things do you see preventing the model from sort of being implementable?
Yeah. I mean, I talked more about, these billing and structural challenges. So insurance not paying for two therapists in the room, or insurance only pay for evidence-based practices, or for a number of um, sessions with a therapist, and these types of limitations that are not clinically driven at all, but are, simple ways to reduce costs. But I think the main barrier is of a different kind here in the US. I think that, just to mention another barrier that is related to what I'm going to tell you next, is this privacy barrier. The idea that even to reach out to the family, you have to sign papers and get consent and all of that, tells you about how this is a society that views individuals, completely on their own. And I think the idea of like a more collectivist approach that involves everyone who's around the person is completely alien to the American idea of pulling yourself by your bootstraps and this over individualistic society that is the United States. So I think there's like fundamentally a cultural and just cultural differences that I think get in the way of thinking about problems as problems between people and within relationships and involving community, because of how the individual is understood here in this country. So that's one barrier. And the other is related to how psychiatry and psychology developed as fields in the United States too. Um, Psychology here, I feel, is a very impoverished field. This idea of behaviors and changing behaviors as if you could teach. And this idea, this pedagogical idea of kind of problems being something that you can learn to fix. And then if if you have a therapist who can teach you how to do like worksheets and whatever, you're going to be able to change your behavior and get better. For someone who had psychoanalytical training and, more psychodynamic uh, training, that idea is almost insulting. And if people knew how to change their behaviors, we wouldn't have any mental health problems at all. You would just teach yourself to get better and get better. And so I think there's just this aversion to introspection and to thinking about people beyond behaviors that I really feel get in the way of this type of approach. It's also a slow approach. The kind of goal of open dialogue is to slow things down. A lot of the issues that people have with coercion, with violence in mental health treatment have to do with situations that escalate quickly and get out of hand and that make people scared. And open dialogue has really good ways of slowing everything down. And this is a country that wants to move fast. There is no time for anything. And there's, people want to optimize their time and all of these ideas that come from kind of the finance world and corporate ideas of how you should manage your time yourself and your goals in life. I think go completely against ideas of being more community oriented and slowing things down.
So what does it look like? So we know that so someone in the family starts a phone call, and whoever it picks the phone chooses a colleague. They go to the house within 24 hours, and they try to engage the everybody involved into this conversation. And really, it seems to just involve, I wouldn't say just, but it seems to involve a lot of meaning making, right? What's happening? What do you think it is? What do you think it is? And exchange those impressions. How does it work here? What is the adaptation from a very practical standpoint looks like? What does it look like here?
In the US,
Yeah.
well, some places in Vermont do like network meetings, right? Where there are two therapists and they can actually meet with the family in the home and they can bring the network together and have as many meetings as needed and how often it is needed. So there are very few places that, are able to do that. Otherwise, there's really in the incorporation of some of the clinical elements in day-to-day regular practice, right? So I've heard of, psychologists and psychiatrists that use reflection, during their individual sessions with the people that they're working with. Some people incorporate some of these more family oriented ideas into their work with children, with people, with intellectual disabilities, and in several different contexts. But mostly what I've seen is that it really gets adapted in a way that resembles kind of ordinary care, but that incorporates some of the clinical elements, either of reflection or of meeting the person with their family or of being more flexible about where to meet. And I don't think there's a place here in the US, and I could be wrong, where they're really practicing open dialogue as they do in Finland, and that it looks exactly like that.
When you mentioned that looks like standard care, we're talking about an office, family at times, or the patient, but the idea of meaning, or and if you have a family, the idea that somehow in this social context, addressing that somehow, is that what we're talking about? Those
Yeah.
concepts inside of an office?
Yeah, sometimes, and not just in office, but in residential services or in many other settings. But incorporating some of these things, some of the ideas, and some of the clinical practices. A lot of family work in the United States is centered on psychoeducation, and this is a very different approach to involving the family in treatment. So incorporating some of those things.
I would not be surprised if you tell me that despite those limitations, considering how things are here, right? How okay, let's make an exercise. Let's be very humble. Let's assume that helping a patient with psychosis to give meaning to his or her experiences is has an impact later in terms of functionality, because back to the finances of it, I suspect it shouldn't be too hard to prove that having someone that would meet diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia go back to work, family, schooling, as because at the end of the day, it seems to me that this initial focus on keeping someone out of the hospital and quiet in his room, considering how neuroleptic cause negative symptoms in addition to whatever the patient's living, um, it's in the short term may look like financially viable, but in the long term, having people go back to actual life would save a whole lot of money, because antipsychotics, they keep releasing new things and they don't come any cheaper every time. And doctors may have an inclination to try the newest and the latest, and that for insurance companies also comes with a huge toll. When I was discussing this thing with folks that I just started as a medical director at a new place, and I was exposing these ideas to them, they said, "Oh, insurance companies must love it." And it's a funny thing, isn't it? I think I wonder if that surprises me that we haven't breached that yet. Um, but in any way, um, I can't prevent to think, and also based on my personal experience, that it has a huge impact even with all those limitations. And by huge impact, I'm thinking, well, these medications are very damaging. If I have a modest impact that allows me to bring doses down and minimize side effects, cognitive impairment, maybe reduce the chances of a stroke later in life, or cholesterol or weight gain, or it sounds to me. So do you see impact with that approach despite the limitations, I'm guessing?
So I think that question is, I'll tell you what I think. I think that open dialogue as a clinical approach is as effective as any other type of psychodynamic psychotherapy. I don't think it's special at all. I think it's really good. There's some aspects of it that I think work really well for psychosis, like the family orientation. A lot of these things are, I think, really, really good for very acute crises. What I think has been challenging for me to articulate, in my research and my work, is that while in science you want to create experimental conditions by removing as much as you can from the context and the environment and looking at the phenomena in isolation, psychiatry adapted that understanding of the individual and wanted to create experimental conditions to understand, what makes this one thing better, but it's all context.
Brilliant.
And if you take the context out, you end up with bizarre things like, schizophrenia is the excess of a neurotransmitter in the brain. And then you attack it with, a drug that blocks, the receptor for that, you know, uh, for that neurotransmitter. So you end up with really weird things when you get the context out of the picture. I think that what's really successful in open dialogue in Finland, in Norway, in Sweden, and in Scandinavia in general is that these are countries that are essentially almost socialist countries that have very little social problems. And so the kind of social determinant part of why people get mental health problems, which is a big part, the one thing we know has a causal relationship to psychosis is trauma early in life. And trauma can be, hunger, can be violence, can be food insecurity, can be homelessness, and a million things that are actually environmental. And so what's interesting to me in the kind of Finnish experiment with open dialogue is that they kind of figured out the social part really nicely. There's, not a lot of poverty. There's a really good network. No one's falling through the cracks. There's no homelessness. And people just have kind of basic human rights and dignity. And then still with all of that, people, get psychosis and people, if you talk to the Finns, they'll say everyone at least once in their life is going to get open dialogue because we're all going to have a crisis in life at least once that we'll need some help getting out of. And and so that's to me is the fascinating piece. That's kind of the social experiment, if you want to put it that way. They figured out the social part really well. And then, with what's left, I think that, their clinical approach is also really smart. But in a place like the United States, you have neither of those things in place. The social problems are so serious in this country, and there is absolutely no effort to address them in a meaningful way, that I just don't see how clinical approaches can mitigate some of these issues that are highly environmental, essentially, and are determined by exposure to risk, violence, and horrible experiences that really put people on, a track to developing bad and serious mental health problems. And then on top of that, you throw very ineffective therapies at them. And in an insurance and in a healthcare system that is a for-profit venture. And you expect what? My my mentor will tell me, he has told me that many times, and I agree with him. Bob Drake will say that a system of care gets the exact outcomes that it's set out to get. And this is what that's the case in the United States. The system is set up to get horrendous outcomes, and people are falling through the cracks all the time. To me, it's a priority to create things like minimum income for everyone, to reduce inequality, to invest in free childcare so that mothers are healthy and can work and can support their children, and don't have to, put their careers at jeopardy to, raise children. I think these types of things, like eliminating food insecurity, homelessness, these are things that are within reach. And I feel like we should start there. And then whatever's left, maybe there are clinical approaches that are superior to others, and that are much better. And also, I don't know of any other medical specialty that thinks it's a good idea to give their patients a medication that takes away 25 years of their life, and thinks that that's, a reasonable outcome for someone. It sounds a little bit like the opposite of what, you know medicine should be doing. So I'm sorry if I answered your question in a way that just made it all seem less manageable.
Well,
But
no,
I don't
no,
think there's a clinical solution to these very serious social problems.
no. There's no clinical solution for the social problems, and unfortunately, there's no solution for the social problems because, and I say that frequently. One of the things that I talk to everyone that I interview, which may be challenging depending on the topic, is to avoid politics, because United States lives this illusion of a polarization, and there's no polarization at all. Polarization exists between, and I said that to Will Hall the last time we spoke. The politicians are all. It's a country where lobby is legal, and that's how I end this conversation. So, but for me, it's hard to accept that because if I don't find ways to I'm going to use the word subversive, as I frequently do, to practice psychiatry in a subversive way, which I have been, and I have been seeing results that are different than the ones that I was sold during my training. Um, there's nobody's coming. There's no help coming, and one of the things is that. Um, the standard of care really keeps everybody kind of in check, and one of the things that I found in terms of standard of care is that informed consent is very selectively actually excluded from the concept of standard of care, even though if you ask anyone, you're going to say, well, what, informed consent is part of standard of care, because of course, right, you don't have to have a paper signed, but the patient has to agree with it. And yet, when it comes to neuroleptics and schizophrenia, we are a legion of pill pushers, and we don't have to be. We have already pretty clear instructions. Maybe not enough research, but we have enough. Well, actually, we have enough research and guidelines for tapering the chronic patients. The the first episode psychosis is still a big challenge, but you can tell, you can smell in the air there's a change going around, because of things like, Vermont, New York, and recently big there was a paper, I think it was in 2002, where they got these international names to come up with a consensus. In pretty much the paper starts saying, well, a lot of people have been questioning the utility of neuroleptics in schizophrenia. And so, we got these kind of big shots, and we're going to review the data. And they reviewed the same data that got us where we are. And the other problem we have, that I think it would be from an awareness perspective, it would be good if PubMed could actually put disclosures right below abstracts, because the disclosure of that article was almost as big as the rest of the paper, and becomes very obvious once you start looking for the right places. It becomes very obvious. Now, um, there's a big paper. It's it's a meta-analysis from Japan on tapering of neuroleptics. And the articles that were included in the meta-analysis, they didn't take particular care on the speed of the tapers, but they still found that the functionality, cognition, volition of patients got much better during the process of tapering. And that is something that my colleagues can see every day by practicing, as long as they do it slowly enough. And you still would be meeting standard of care, because frequently is the will of the patient. So, but I get your point. Of course, we have so many problems that will prevent a model like that of working. Um, they do not seem, however, to increase the prevalence of the schizophrenia in terms of the onset of the psychosis, but they seem to hamper the recovery from the crisis.
Do you mean the finish?
Meaning that they don't have we don't have any data saying they have less than 1 to 2% of prevalence in psychosis. They have, as new onset, they have a decline in the persistence of symptoms with their treatment method. And a lot of people in the field now are saying, well, the symptoms are persisting because of the drugs, but you cannot just remove them. We got to do something. And that's where we fail to have a model of treatment that meets people in their housing with their families, and at times what house and what family, as you mentioned. Any thoughts on those comments? I imagine your gears are probably turning.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're referring to the fact that there was a reduction in prevalence of schizophrenia, which is a time, which is what you're talking about. You need to have there's a time criteria to that diagnosis. So you need to have symptoms for at least a certain period of time to get it, whereas, a psychotic episode is time limited. And they did report And that actually made international news at the time, that they reported um, the same kind of prevalence as you were saying, or new cases of first episode psychosis, but they had a reduction in prevalence of schizophrenia, which is the persistence of symptoms, as you were saying. Um, that data is not really that accepted in the scientific community, because you can't really establish the causality of sort of why that happened. And there's a lot of questioning of whether those things are related or not. And especially, because diagnostic practices are so inconsistent, everyone finds little flaws in these types of studies. And it's of course, you would expect the prevalence of something that's more serious, like serious illness, to reduce when you find effective treatments. In the case of HIV is a good example of that, right? I mean, people get HIV, but if you treat it with antiretrovirals, people don't get AIDS as much. And, it doesn't evolve to serious illness if you treat it. So you get a reduction in the prevalence of AIDS because you have effective treatments for HIV infection. So they that study in particular is, and a lot of studies involving open dialogue are questioned for how rigorous they are, and some conclusions that came from these studies are questioned by the broader scientific community. One of the reasons is because, as you mentioned at the start of our conversation, there have been no really well designed randomized control trials, which they are the gold standard for high quality evidence in the medical field. But as we were talking about before, they may not be the most appropriate method for psychiatry and mental health. It's really hard to do, for example, a double-blind placebo trial with a drug that completely sedates you. That kind of unblinds um, your group sort of immediately, right? If you take a medication that causes
It does favor the randomized control trial. Does favor the research for in favor of medications.
right, exactly,
I find surprising you telling me that they find a decline in the chronicity of psychotic presentations, and everybody questions it. We have a escalating prevalence of bipolarity and ADHD in the United States,
right,
and nobody questions. Everybody embraces it,
absolutely.
and
Yeah, it's a double
it
standard,
becomes clear that we are talking about a publicity campaign,
right?
right? And whatever publicity can go against this machine is not going to be welcome, or is going to be sapped from every angle. And also, one thing that I've noticed is that it threatens a lot people's sense of meaning, even, or their role. Because when I talk to some colleagues in psych and peace, I have to carefully present these ideas and carefully suggest ways out of it. And I didn't know that. I learned that by doing. I have a mentoring institute, and I would present all these problems and questions. And I was just in that phase at that time, just saying, "Hey, this thing all looks out of whack." And it was a student that gave me a feedback. She said, "You can tell you're generating a lot of anxiety. It would help if you present a path, not necessarily a solution." She was very mature. She said, "But a path towards a better practice, a resolution." And we have those. We are. It's an art. It's resourceful enough, but overcoming this barrier, the resistance that it causes in my colleagues. I do enjoy causing anxiety. I can overwhelm people when I'm talking about things, and I've been working very hard on it. But there are actual obstacles. Even after I change my approach to these things, I still see them, and it's like smart people, intelligent people, flexible people will get me feedback about the episode. Like when I interviewed Adderhold, a good friend of mine said, like, he used this expression, cognitive dissonance. He said, I can't, man. It's like it's a completely different view of how we were trained. And I said trained to believe, because we don't have evidence of any of these things, these assumptions about schizophrenia or, psychosis in general. Um, Hannah, do you have anything else you'd like to share tonight?
Yeah, I think you're doing really meaningful work with your podcast and kind of showcasing alternatives and people. It's good with podcasts because they can pause and come back to it later, and they can listen in their own time, and they can learn, without becoming too overwhelmed. Um, yeah, I think what I wanted to say is that generating meaning for difficult experiences is really very powerful. And it seems like the simple thing to do, but it's not. And also building relationships is crucial. We all know this from our own lived experience. So I feel like a return to some common sense would do psychiatry a lot of good. And I'm happy, there are people out there finding these things and listening to your podcast, and maybe slowly we'll change some of the attitudes towards medications and treatment, not just in the US, but in the rest of the world as well. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for accepting. If I wouldn't, I would be babbling by myself looking to the camera if it wasn't for your presence and the presence of many people, and some of them you introduced to me. So thank you again.
Absolutely.